Hi everybody, very welcome to Mentour and yet another video podcast. As always, I hope you're doing absolutely fantastic. This week it's exactly 19 years since one of the most famous aviation accidents of all time. We are talking about Air Transat 236, the Atlantic glider. And in this episode, I will tell you the reason why this happened. I will talk about things like confirmation bias and what happened if flight crew are not properly trained about the systems and some of the malfunctions that they might encounter. And also about the incredible skill of both the flight crew and the cabin crew that led up to the final result. Stay tuned.
Wind 31016, everyone right, set on. Clear to land, 31 right.
Delta 260,
This video is brought to you in cooperation with NordVPN. Now, a question for you. Would you ever sit down in a public toilet without closing the door? Well, if not, then you should probably ask yourself why you would ever sit down and use a public Wi-Fi without a proper VPN. Now, NordVPN is your virtual toilet door. It will keep prying eyes from looking into your browser history and trying to steal your password. It is incredibly fast with thousands of servers over 59 different countries. And also, with only one subscription, you can use up to 6 different devices. Those of you who uses this link here below will get a whopping 68% discount of the 2-year deal with NordVPN plus 1 month for free. So go in and use it. It will cost you less than $3.71 per month. So start protecting yourself on the internet today. Alright my friends, so we are going to be talking about the Atlantic glider, Air Transat 236. This is an amazing story that contains so much things that you can learn about, how we've gotten to where we are flight safety wise, and also what happens to us as humans when we are faced with things that we just cannot make sense out of. But in order to understand the Air Transat 236 incident, we need to start a little bit before the actual flight. So the aircraft that is involved is an Airbus 330, okay? It has a Rolls-Royce RB211 engine fitted to it, and about 4 days before the flight, they were doing routine maintenance on this aircraft, and they found in the oil filter some metal chips, right? This is part of standard maintenance procedures, and when they find metal chips in the oil filter, it means that some kind of failure is about to happen. Like there's some kind of component that is about to fail inside of the engine. But in this case, they couldn't find where those metal chips were coming from. So they decided rather than trying to search further, they would just change the engine and send the engine in for proper maintenance. Now the issue here was that Air Transat didn't have any spare engine in the whole of North America. So they had to get a loan engine in from Rolls-Royce, which was flown in from Hong Kong. The maintenance crew started changing the engine. It was scheduled to be a work that would take a few days to do. But fairly quickly, they started realizing that the new engine that they had didn't fit well into the cowling. They couldn't fit all the components correctly. So they started looking into why that might be. And they found something called a service bulletin. This is where an engine manufacturer decides to change something on an engine. And in this case, the Rolls-Royce company had found that the RB211 engine had some problems with the hydraulic pumps. So they had put a service bulletin in about how to change the hydraulic pumps, and with that, they would also have to change the hydraulic lines and the fuel lines. And the problem they have here is that the engines that were fitted onto the aircraft was engines that was after the service bulletin, and the loan engine was an engine from before the service bulletin. So there were 2 different hydraulic pumps. This service bulletin would have said exactly how to do this maintenance work and what things needed to be changed. But due to a computer failure in the maintenance control unit, they couldn't find the service bulletin. So they called Rolls-Royce and they asked what to do. And they got some advice, basically that they needed to change all of the units in order for it to be in a after service bulletin mode. The problem was that they only had the after service bulletin hydraulic pump and had, let's say, fuel lines. They didn't have the hydraulic line that was required. So what they did was they changed the hydraulic pumps, the fuel lines, and then they used the old hydraulic line. Now, when they fitted all this together and they looked at it, they noticed that the hydraulic line and the fuel line came very, very close to each other, but they managed to achieve some clearance in between them. This was checked by the maintenance engineers, and they decided that the clearance between the two lines was enough. All right. But what they hadn't accounted for was the fact that when they were installing this, there was no pressure in the lines. But as hydraulic pressure was applied to the hydraulic line, it would stiffen out, and that clearance that was in between the lines would effectively disappear. This was never found, was never understood. The engine did a proper ground run, everything looked fine, so the aircraft was released to service. On the 24th of August 2001, Captain Robert Pichet and First Officer Dirk de Jager was preparing themselves for a standard flight from Toronto in Canada over to Lisbon in Portugal. This is a flight that takes them out over the Atlantic Ocean, and because of that they need something called ETOPS approval, which means that they need to be able to fly more than 1 hour away, single engine, from any of the alternates. This is not a problem. The Airbus 330 has ETOPS approval, and so did the company. So this was not really an issue. They fueled the aircraft up. They departed with about 46.9 tons of fuel, which is 5.5 tons extra. That's on top of what they needed legally. So they had plenty of fuel on board. The flight took off at around 9 o'clock local. That was about midnight UTC time from Toronto. And the first 4 hours or so of the flight was completely normal. Everything worked like it should. At time 4:38, approximately UTC, these fuel line and hydraulic lines have been kind of rubbing up against each other continuously for these 4 hours. And at that point, the fuel line ruptured and a huge hole opened up. It is estimated from the final report that they were losing about 12 to 15 tons of fuel per hour through the hole, right? And that should be kind of compared to the normal fuel use of an engine, which is about 2.6 tons of fuel on the Airbus 330. So they now had a huge fuel leak in the number 2, the right-hand engine. But there was no indication of this, and the engine was working fine. And because of the way that the fuel system is constructed on the Airbus 330, the aircrew didn't notice anything. Because you have several fuel tanks in an Airbus 330. You have 2 wing tanks in each wing. You also have a center tank, which is used first, and then you have a trim tank, which is seated back in the aft stabilizer. The trim tank normally works by transferring fuel from the back towards the front to keep the aircraft within its center of gravity limits. But when the fuel starts to deplete in the wing tanks, the trim tank notices this and start transferring fuel forward and into the wing tank that is low on fuel. This is something that the aircraft does absolutely automatically. All right? There is an indication in the cockpit, but this indication, since this is normal procedures and it happens all the time, it's not something that the pilots would immediately pick up. Now, what happened here was that the trim tank started its final fuel transfer, all its fuel forward into the tanks way too early. Normally it would do that maybe half an hour or so before they arrived to the destination, but in this case it was only about 4 hours or 5 hours into the flight. This was not picked up by the crew. Instead, the crew did a standard position and situation report. When you fly transatlantic flights and you fly into oceanic airspace, you need to, at different intervals, do these position reports because you are not in any kind of radar contact at that point. So you need to have an HF radio, especially at that time, and report in your time, where you are, and so on, to whatever control unit that you're talking to. In this case, it was Santa Maria control. while the crew was doing this, they did that when they passed the longitude 30 west. And they took the time then to do just an overview of the systems as well. So not only do the position report, but check how the engine is doing, how much fuel they have, and so on. And this is where they started noticing some strange things. So when they opened up the secondary display and they looked at the engine instrumentation, they realized that they had a much lower oil temperature on the right-hand engine. They had a much higher oil pressure and lower oil quantity. Now this was a strange indication to have, and they didn't really understand it. Now what they didn't know at the time was that this was actually an indication of the fuel leak. But there's no way at that point that they could have made that kind of parallel. Because the way that oil is being cooled down is that the oil transfers past the fuel. Okay, so the fuel is being used to cool down the oil. Normally you have a fairly low fuel transfer rate, so the oil will be kind of medium cool down. But since they had this gaping hole, the fuel was now rushing through the oil cooler, much higher rate than it would normally. And remember, the fuel is really cold. They're up at 39,000 feet, really cold fuel that's now being transferred really, really fast past the oil filter. And that was cooling the oil much more. And as the oil got cooler, obviously its viscosity increased. So that increased the oil pressure, and since it's now flowing slower, it was returning slower down into the oil filter, and that's why they had these indications. So it was an indication of the fuel leak, but very hard to interpret. In any case, the crew reported this back via high-frequency radio to their maintenance control center and said, we have some weird indications here. Can you have a look into that? Maintenance control started looking into it, couldn't find any reason for it anyway. And while the crew was dealing with this, there was an ECAM message, okay, or an advisory. ECAM stands for Electronic Centralized Aircraft Monitoring System, and it's built to pop up when there is actions needed by the crew. So it can be an advisory message, which is something is coming on, but it's still within parameters, or it can be an emergency message, which requires immediate attention. In this case, an advisory message came up, but because the crew had opened the secondary display on the engine display, it didn't automatically click up. It was just seen as an advisory message. So once the crew had finished dealing with this oil pressure issue, they saw the advisory message, they opened it up, and they realized that they had a fuel imbalance. Now, a fuel imbalance is basically an indication that there are more fuel in one tank than in the other. Right? This is not good because we want the aircraft to be balanced and it wants to be stabilized for when we're controlling the aircraft. But this didn't make any sense to the crew. There was no, at that point they hadn't been trained in the simulator about imbalances. They did deal with imbalances during simulator sessions every 6 months, but that was always connected to an engine failure, because when we experience an engine failure, then the engine that is now failed is not going to use any fuel from its main tank, and the other engine will be using fuel, so you will start to get an imbalance because of that. And because of that, as part of the engine failure checklist, you will also deal with an imbalance. But in most cases, you would do that by heart, by opening the crossfeed valve, which is the connection between the tanks. It's a kind of a tube in between the tanks, and turning off the pumps on the low side. By doing that, you would start to feed fuel from the tank that have the most fuel, but not from the low one. So that way you can start to kind of equal out the imbalance. There is a non-normal checklist for this. There is a Q-rate checklist, but normally when you're flying the Airbus 330, there is ECAM actions to be done. And in case of the imbalance, there is no ECAM actions. It just tells you that you have an imbalance, and then you are supposed to take up the Q-rate checklist and use the checklist instead to deal with the imbalance. But since the crew was well versed in dealing with imbalances from their simulator check, the captain decided to do this by heart. All right, so you just opened the crossfeed valve, turned off the right-hand fuel pumps, and started transferring fuel from one side to the other. Obviously, in this case, what he was actually doing was that he was taking fuel from the left-hand side and just pushing it out this huge gaping hole on the right side. If he would have taken up the checklist, the first point that he would have found on the checklist would have said, do not do this checklist if you think you have a fuel leak. Right? So in case of fuel leak, do not balance fuel. That point had been placed into the checklist because these kind of things had happened before. And it was known to Airbus, for example, that these kind of things could happen and that you could potentially be losing a lot more fuel if you did this procedure and you had a fuel leak. So the balance procedure was really only there, like in the case of an engine failure, for example, or if there is a tiny imbalance because of different output pressure in the pumps in order to equalize it. But in case of a fuel leak, you cannot use this checklist. Now the crew was not even thinking about fuel leaks at this point. Like I was saying, there hadn't been any real scenario training in the simulator about fuel leaks at all, not during the type rating, not during recurrent training, and no real emphasis was put on it. So the crew was sitting there and they were looking at the situation, and what they thought they had was a computer glitch, a computer fault, because they saw the oil pressure indications, the oil quantity indications, the oil temperature indications, and now they had this fuel indication, and they were not connected. So they immediately thought, okay, there's some kind of computer glitch here. This doesn't make any sense. But one thing that did worry them quite a bit was that when they did the fuel checks, when they checked how much fuel they had on board, remember, they had 5.5 tons extra when they left Toronto, they now saw that they had much less fuel on board. Right? And this did not make any kind of sense to them because the engines were working normally, everything had looked fine, but they had this imbalance and now the fuel was disappearing and they could not make this kind of square with their mental model. And their mental model was a computer glitch. So the crew got their first indication that something was wrong at time 0503. That's when they started looking into the oil indications. At time 0533, they got the imbalance indication, or they saw the imbalance indication, and only about 10 minutes later they realized that we are not going to have enough fuel to continue on to Lisbon. So they started looking into what alternates they had, and they found an alternate in the Azores called Lejes Airport, that's on the island of Terceira. They started looking into and decided to divert to this airport to get this all sorted out. And while they were talking about this, the cabin crew came in. The cabin crew wanted to tell the pilots that they had wheelchair passengers on board and that they could relay that information to Lisbon. And the pilots then told the cabin crew that, listen, we are going to have to divert to the Azores because of a technical issue. But they also wanted the cabin crew to go back and have a look at the wings. So the cabin crew member went out, turned off the lights in the cabin, because remember this is nighttime, and used a flashlight and looked out of the wings. Couldn't see anything. Remember, this fuel leak is happening inside of the engine on the right hand side, and whatever fuel kind of vapor that would be coming out, the vapor trail after the engine, would be under the wing and would be very hard to see, especially during nighttime. So the cabin crew member came back in, told the pilot that, listen, I can't see anything. And this just reinforced the mental model the pilots have that this is a computer glitch. Because now, you have all of these indications, there's no visible fuel leak, something's wrong, right? This is what I was talking about, confirmation bias, okay? Confirmation bias is where you make up a mental model of what's going on. This is what's happening. And then instead of constantly questioning the mental model, seeing if it's correct, you just try to find the different things that reinforces the picture that you had. And this is what the crew is doing at this point. They're looking at a computer glitch, and everything they hear confirms that picture, even though what they actually have is a huge fuel leak. Right? Now the way to get out of something like that is to constantly apply the PIOC model. Remember, I did a video about that, where you check what the problem is, you get constant information, you look at options, you look at selecting whatever options you want to do, execute that and evaluate. Crucially, evaluate. All right? But you always evaluate your situation based on new information and try to do so from kind of an objective view angle. Obviously, at this point, the crew is situated in, a lot of stress. There's a lot of strange indications. The fuel is constantly tripping down. And during this, the captain who's pilot flying is in contact with maintenance control center. He does different configurations of the fuel system, depending on what, he thinks might be right, but ending up in the end in the same situation where fuel is just flowing from both tanks out through the hole. At time 5:59, that's about 25 minutes after they saw the initial indication of the fuel imbalance, the fuel is indicating 3 tons in the left wing, 1 ton in the right wing. And about 14 minutes later, the right engine flames out. Okay? So when that engine flames out, the crew goes through the engine failure checklist. They start the descent down to their single engine service seating, which is what you have to do if you have an engine failure in cruise. I've done a video about that if you want to check it out as well. And they're still not understanding why this is happening. They're still thinking that this might be a computer fault of some sort. They now have about 600 kilos in the whole aircraft, right? Both tanks, all tanks, 600 kilos left. At this point, the first officer calls out a mayday call. They call out mayday, 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 Air Transat 236, and that they have fuel problems and an engine failure. He also does a PA to the cabin crew and the passengers, telling them that they're going to land shortly and that there might be an off-field landing. So they're preparing the cabin for a potential ditching. All right. At time 06:26, so that's 13 minutes after the initial engine failure, they're now at about 65 nautical miles away from Leches Airport, and they're at flight level 340, 34,000 feet more or less. The remaining left-hand engine starves of fuel and flames out. Now it becomes very quiet, guys. When both engines flames out, the aircraft becomes quiet. The only thing that you can hear is the air rushing over the wings and the air outside. All the cabin lighting would have disappeared and been replaced by the emergency lighting, which is only showing the emergency exits. So this would have been terrifying back in the cabin for the passengers. But the cabin crew is doing a great job at this point. They are briefing in both French and in English, and they also found a cabin crew member who can speak Portuguese to make the instructions for how to put the emergency life vests on and how to prepare for a potential evacuation later on. At about 17,000 feet, as the aircraft is now gliding down toward Leches, what's going on in the cabin is that the oxygen masks are falling out. And that's because the engines, which are normally pressurizing the aircraft, are both failed. So the aircraft is leaking pressurization out, which means that the cabin altitude is slowly going up to meet the aircraft's actual altitude. And when the cabin altitude goes about 14,000 feet, the oxygen masks automatically falls down, and that would probably have scared the passengers even more. The flight crew is now concentrating on getting the aircraft down safely onto Leches. The captain, which is an expert pilot, has been flying 14,000 hours in total and has actually got quite a lot of glider experience as well, is handling the aircraft beautifully down towards the airport. He ends up at about an 8 miles final from runway 33 at 13,000 feet. So very, very high. You would normally be about 3,000 feet at 10 miles if you have both engines running. So he asks to do a 360 turn to lose altitude. When you do a 360 turn, when you're gliding in an airliner, you will lose between 4,000 and 5,000 feet. That means that he will end up on final again at about 8,000 feet. So still high, very high. But at this point, he will also extended the slats as part of the both engines failure checklist on the Airbus 330. They're also extending the landing gear, and he is executing these S-turns on final in order to lose altitude and energy as much as possible. Now, if you've seen the video that I did about when I was in the simulator and I lost both engines and I had to return back to Dublin, where she was taken off from, you would have seen that I did the same thing, that I kind of flew through the localizer and then snaked my way back. That's just in order to lose as much energy as possible when you realize that you are much higher than you want. If you are not sure, it's better just to aim straight for the airport. But Captain Piché ended up over the threshold at about 200 knots, which of course is much higher speed than you normally have. He touched down about 1,000 feet down the runway. That's about 300 meters down the runway, which is pretty much where we normally touch down. But because he didn't have flight spoilers and ground spoilers working because of the loss of both engines, the aircraft had so much energy that it bounced up again and it touched down a further 350 meters further down the runway. Now he doesn't have that much runway left, so he just slams on the brakes. And since, once again, he only has brake accumulator pressure and there's no anti-skid system working, as he puts full max manual braking on, the wheels lock up. They start to just shear down the tires until the tires blow up. The aircraft falls down onto its landing gear and continues to kind of skid towards a complete stop on the runway. This is a fantastic feat by both of these pilots. Now, as they come to a complete stop, there are some small fires that breaks out around the blown up tires, which the firefighters immediately put out. But because of this and the fact that they have a fuel leak, Captain Piché decides to evacuate the aircraft. And during the evacuation, 14 passengers and 2 cabin crew members get some mild injuries. And why am I highlighting this? Well, that's because when I did my video about Qantas Flight 32, I got a lot of questions from people saying that why didn't the captain just decide to evacuate, just to be on the safe side? And what I was trying to explain in that video, and I am explaining now, is that evacuation itself can cause quite a lot of injuries. The absolute best thing to do is to do a rapid disembarkation using normal stairs if it is possible. In this case, quite rightfully, they decided to evacuate, but it goes to show that the only injuries during this whole ordeal, with all of these technical problems and the dual engine failure and the landing and everything, the only injuries actually came when they evacuated the aircraft. And that was also partially due to, it was found in the investigation later, that people were reluctant to jump out to the slides. They would have to be kind of pushed out by the cabin crew, and also they were trying to get their hand luggage with them. At least a few of them did. So once again, if you are in an evacuation situation, follow the cabin crew command, get out as rapidly as possible, jump out and get away from the aircraft. The aircraft received some minor damages. It had some structural problems because of the wings and a little bit of the body because of the very high force when they touched down, both the first and the second time. And obviously they had the landing gear issue because of the burnt out tires. But it was fixable. The aircraft went back to flying. And in the final report, after this was all over, and by the way, as always, I'm linking down to the final report in the description of the video, there were a couple of findings. So the way that the spare engine had been fitted to the aircraft without proper regard to the service bulletin was shown to be the cause of the fuel leak in the first place. Okay, that was number one. Number two, the crew not being properly trained to deal with imbalances caused by fuel leaks and not having dealt with fuel leaks during their training in any kind of reasonable way led them down the rabbit hole of starting to balance fuel by heart, which made them miss the crucial step of asking themselves whether or not they had a fuel leak. And also, they weren't really, even if they would have seen that, it's possible that they wouldn't have considered it a fuel leak because of their limited training. Because of this, the next finding was that Airbus needed to provide more indications of the possibility of a fuel leak But basically more training for the flight crew. And there was also some general indications around what happens in the cockpit CRM-wise once you have a mental model made up and then you go into this confirmation bias stage, how hard it is for the pilots to get out of that and in order to kind of rectify a previous mental model mistake. So we have learned loads of this. Right? This is one of those incidents that have led to more emphasis in training, not only on Airbus, but on Boeing as well, about how to deal with fuel leaks and how to read non-normal checklists, things like this. So once again, this incident has led to a lot of improvement, safety-wise, in the airline industry. And this is how we deal with this. This is why I'm doing these videos, by the way, so that you guys can listen to this and you can see where they, went wrong, where the mistakes were made, and then we, as an industry, can become better, both maintenance-wise, both from an airline point of view, from a pilot point of view. We always try to learn from incidents like this. Guys, I hope that you've enjoyed this. I hope that I have earned a subscription for you. If you like videos like this, then make sure that you subscribe and you highlight the little notification bell so that you know when I come up with new videos. And check out the other videos in this series. I've started to make a few of them. There will be more coming. Next week, I promise I'm not going to do a video about an incident or accident. I'm going to do something about a system instead. So stay tuned for next Friday when that video will come out. But for now, come in. Join me in discussions down here in the comments of the video, or get the absolutely free Mentour Aviation app where you can discuss with me or other professional pilots about things like this. And see you next time, I guess. Have an absolutely fantastic day, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye. Right, guys, I really hope that you liked that. If you want more content like that, more aviation content, well then, check this out. I hope that you have subscribed to the channel and that you've highlighted the little notification bell. See you inside of the Mentour Aviation app and have an absolutely fantastic day. Bye-bye.